explanation. What was it about Edna that made it so difficult for me to accept the fact that she was no longer there? And I finally decided that the answer was that Edna had not seemed to change over many years. Her looks didn't change, her voice didn't change, she did not appear to age. There was a stability about Edna, a constancy, the sense of a solid, real self. Somehow, she didn't appear vulnerable. Indeed, the same constancy characterized her conduct in response to the challenge of the last few months of her life. Living these months of uncertainty, dread, and hope was a task. It was a mission. It was an undertaking. And Edna faced that task in her own perfect and characteristic way. Who else would have expressed anger with the injustice of fate by translating a poem by Goethe into perfect Hebrew? There was in Edna a remarkable fusion of the complete and fully engaged Israeli and the refined member of the European professional elite. She was the platoon commander in officer training school, of whom her cadets, including Ruth Beit and Judith Richter, were speaking with fond admiration 40 years later. A perfect fit to that role. But I also remember an occasion some 20 years ago, waiting for the light to change so I could walk across Banbury Road in Oxford. On the other side of the road, there was a trio of cyclists, a mother and two daughters, all perfectly dressed, as I remember, with hats and scarves. They made such a perfect picture that I remember the phrase that came to my mind, the very flower of English womanhood. And it was only when we came close in the crossing that I recognized Edna and her twin daughters. And again, that was a perfect fit. But there was not a sense that Edna stepped in and out of these roles depending on circumstances. She seemed to be the same person everywhere, cool and bright and clear, even in her academic work. I'm not an expert, but I have read some of her work. Most recently, her book on the Dead Sea Scrolls and her analysis of the famous incident of the camera in the kitchen in the center. And I was struck by the consistency of her voice. It was a voice that could read poetry, that could run a meeting, that could write a scholarly argument, and it was the same voice. If I had to choose one adjective for Edna, it would be elegant. That word has multiple meanings, but the one that comes closest, for me, is the elegance of a mathematical proof. It is not elegance for its own sake, and it is not about appearances. An elegant proof makes a point, and it makes that point in a way that cannot be improved. It is straightforward, it is lucid, it is witty, it is cool. In short, it is beautiful. And so was Edna. My talk today is about psychology and rationality. I mean, what else have I been talking about for a long time? And I want to begin by a brief discussion of the word rationality, which is a word that troubles me a lot. And what troubles me about it is that it's a word in two languages. It is a word in the everyday language, where basically rational is a slightly pedantic word for reasonable, and perhaps with a lower than usual component of emotion, but it's not very different from reasonable. But for professionals within decision theory or economics, the word rational has a completely different meaning. And it has the meaning of consistency of beliefs and consistency of preferences, the absence of internal contradictions in the systems of beliefs or preferences. And you have to see how extraordinarily demanding that definition is. Because what it means is that it's not only that you're able to be consistent by applying a rule so that if you have one belief, then you can infer or derive the other belief. Two beliefs that you consider independently, if they are logically consistent, when you think about them together, they will be logically consistent when you think about them separately. This is an enormously complicated thing, and it's one that basically people cannot do. So that the issue of rationality, in some sense, as an ideal for people, fails right there. Now, another problem I have with the word rationality, that I really don't like the word irrational. Maya was telling me that I have used it. I'm a little ashamed if I did. To me, irrational conveys the image of, frothing at the mouth, of somebody who is impulsive, who is acting on strong emotions, who is unusually stubborn, isn't listening to reason. That's what all of that is irrational. And I think that the research in which collectively a lot of us have been involved over the last 45 years or so, certainly more than 40, the research has not established that people are irrational. What I think the research has shown is that people do not conform to the professional sense of rationality. The rational agent model is not descriptively adequate. It is not that people are not rational, and certainly not that people are irrational. I believe in either of those. More than 40 years ago, Amos and I, Tversky and I got together, and we got together to study our own statistical intuitions because we knew that they were wrong. That is, I had been teaching statistics for a while, and I knew that when I didn't compute, if I just tried to do as I felt I should, for example, as many people do in deciding on the size of the number of subjects that they will use in running an experiment, I would do that intuitively, and I would do that stupidly. I discovered that, by reading an article, how stupidly I was doing it. Turns out I was in very good company. Most psychologists, when they pick a sample size that's too small, and to an extent that they accept a gamble, basically, in which they have a 50% chance not to confirm their hypothesis, even if their hypothesis is true. Now, this is completely absurd. No psychologist would do that. They do it because they don't know they're doing it, and they do it because their intuitions are wrong, their statistical intuitions are wrong. And so we started with that problem of our statistical intuitions and those of our colleagues. And we went on in the same ways, finding problems in which our intuitions violated some rules of logic and that we believed in. And so when we computed an answer, we reached the correct answer, but when we just asked ourselves, what would I do intuitively, we would do something else. And we never studied any mistake or failure of rationality, if you want to call it that didn't apply to us. We always discovered them in ourselves, and we really never thought that we were studying irrationality or stupidity. We're basically studying ourselves and the way that our minds work. And we were not modest enough to think we were stupid. We thought people are reasonable. We actually did not intend our work as a critique of the rational agent model, certainly not at first. And we came to think of it that way because other people saw it that way. That is, we had colleagues, economists, who looked at our work and they appreciated the examples because they worked on them. And they said, well, if people are prone to make such mistakes on such simple problems, then it is difficult to reconcile that with the perfect rationality of the rational agent model. And then we moved into that. But for many years, that we were just doing the psychology of judgment. We were not dealing with the rational agent model. More recently, I've looked back at what Amos and I did, and I've looked back at it in light of what's happened since. And a distinction that we drew in our very first paper on intuition, we drew a distinction between intuition and computation. That is, that when you choose a sample size, you can choose it intuitively, or you can compute what gamble you're taking with different sizes of samples. And we strongly recommended that people should follow their computations and not follow their intuitions. But we really didn't have a very clear idea of what intuition is and what computation is and what the boundary is between them. And we remained extremely vague about this, actually, throughout our work. More recently, And that's because of work that has developed elsewhere, the idea of two systems of mind or two processes in the mind. It's become possible to understand in a slightly different way the early work that Amos and I did together on errors of reasoning, errors of thinking, and a lot of work that has been done since. And the distinction between intuitive thinking and computational thinking I can illustrate, not using slides, I'm going to ask you to imagine things. But when I say 2 plus 2, something happens to you. The number 4 occurred to you, and it came to your mind immediately, and it came to your mind without you having to work at it. Now, if I say 17 times 28, for most of you, nothing happened. You didn't produce it because there is no built-in association between 17 times 28 and a number. 17 times 24 is my usual example, to which I do know the answer. It's 408. Now, you can produce that number, but then you decide to produce that number. It's work, and it's physiological work. You can record it, you can measure the size of the pupils, you can measure the heart rate, and both increase. And so mental and physical work are involved in this computation. So that there is that broad classification, and it's obvious to all of us, and it's accessible to all of us, that there are those two ways that thoughts come to mind. So fast thinking, as I call it, is the one that, brings you the name of a city when I say capital of Moscow. It is the one that causes you to have quite a complex response when I mention the word, say an emotional word, and I'll mention it, the word vomit. Now, when you heard that word, a lot happened to you. And among the things, physiological things happen to you. Your heart rate changes, your blood pressure changed, your galvanic skin response changed. Many things occurred. You made a disgust face. You had a feeling of disgust. You had memories. None of the memories were pleasant. And you had theories. You had causal antecedents of vomit. So when I show the slides, I show two words, banana and vomit. And people automatically create a scenario that links those two. And they do it without having to think. It happens to them. And that is the main mark of what we now call System 1 thinking. It happens automatically and effortlessly and subjectively. The experience is that this is something that happens to you and not something that you do. In contrast, there are activities that only System 2 can perform. And when System 1 is stumped, then System 2 will step in, and those require attention. And so, for example, deliberate computation, that's one example. Any deliberate action, any choice that involves moving back and forth between two alternatives mentally requires effort and mobilizes effort. Whereas an attitude to a single object, whether you want to approach it or avoid it, that can be an automatic response. A choice never is a fully automatic response. If it involves back and forth, it involves deliberate attention and the switching of attention. So choosing between two pairs of shoes, parking in a narrow space, all of these activities, and they are varied activities, demand attention, mobilize effort, and they are what I tend to call System 2 thinking or slow thinking. So we have fast thinking, which is effortless and automatic. We have slow thinking, which in general is effortful, more effortful, and is subjectively related to a sense of agency and to a sense of limited capacity, because one of the characteristics of an activity that you can only perform effortfully is that it's something that you cannot do while you're making a left turn into traffic, and you shouldn't try. So, if you're asking or somebody asks you the product of 17 times 24, you will normally stop thinking about it when you're making the left turn into traffic. This, by the way, the reason that cell phones are so dangerous in cars, and whether or not there is a speaker on, is that the person who is on the other side talking to you doesn't know what situation you are in traffic. And there may be a situation that calls for attention, but the other person doesn't know it and will continue speaking, and you're in conflict between survival and politeness, and sometimes politeness wins. So that's, this is an example of system 2, as we call it, both allocating attention and providing attention. Now, an important characteristic of system 2, and I will explain in a minute that those systems are just fictions, they don't really exist, but before I say that, I will speak about system 2, that agent in the mind. I will speak of it as lazy. And it clearly works, you know, if you like more complicated words, it works on a principle of least effort. And it does basically as little as possible. And I'll give you an example, which is a riddle that Shane Frederick came up with when we were working together. And this is the riddle. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Now, what's interesting about this problem is that a number comes to absolutely everybody's mind. And that's because system 1, the automatic system, is basically associative memory. And there is a number that associatively is very strongly evoked by this problem, and that number is 10 cents. That number is wrong. I mean, you know, I won't bother you, but you know, so that you can hear the rest of the lecture. The correct answer is 5 cents. And it's very easy to find out that the correct answer is not 10 cents, because 10 cents and $1.10 is $1.20 and not $1.10. So clearly that answer is wrong. What is remarkable is the number of people who do not check, the number of people who make that mistake. It's about 50% of Princeton students, Harvard students, MIT students are not better. Most universities are significantly worse. There are universities where 85% of students in a written questionnaire will take 10 cents as an answer. Now, we know something really important about the people who write 10 cents. They didn't check. They could have checked, and if they had checked, they would have stopped themselves and found the correct answer. Almost everyone can. They didn't check. It turns out, and that is what I mean when I say that system 2 is lazy, it turns out that we can think of those two systems, and I'll explain what the systems are in a minute, but you can think of those two systems. And system 1 is the one that very quickly comes up with answers. And system 2 is continuously monitoring what is happening to system 1, and in some sense is in control. So we don't say anything that comes to mind, but we say many things that come to mind. And in the image that I'm trying to draw, it is really, system 2 is in charge in the sense that it can stop things and it can inhibit things and it can replace intuition by computation deliberately, but most of the time it doesn't. Most of the time system 1 proposes and system 2 endorses the proposals. And impressions become beliefs, and vague intentions become decisions, and people are not aware that this is the process through which things occur. What we are aware of is our awareness. We're aware of, basically, of system 2. We are very little aware of the work that is being done, mostly unconsciously, within the associative memory system, which tend to produce those very quick responses. Now, are there two systems? Are there two people inside the brain? Let me tell you immediately, there are no two systems. It's a fiction. It's a very useful fiction for a reason that is rooted in psychology. I mean, it's simply a fact of psychology, of your psychology and of mine. there are words, abstract words, which make very poor subjects of sentences, like saying mental arithmetic demands effort and causes pupils to dilate, and so on. This is a complicated sentence. But if you are fairly familiar with the idea that System 2 is effortful, when you say System 2 is involved in mental arithmetic, or System 2 does mental arithmetic, for some reason, this is very easy. And the reason is that our memory is specialized for understanding agents. We understand agents, we attribute traits to agents, we attribute behavior to agents, we remember the behavior of agents in ways that simply do not apply when we're thinking about abstract sentences. So there are no two systems, but the fiction that there are two systems saves an enormous amount of mental work, both for you and for me, and it turns out to be a very useful fiction. That is, they tend to develop, as we think about them, they tend to develop personalities, we tend to develop an understanding of how they work, and we're generally not far off. Now, there are several characteristics to the way that associative memory works, which determine the way that, that we think. And one of the important characteristics of associative memory is that it comes up with solutions that tend to be coherent. And the coherence comes from the very workings of associative memory. So if, for example, the word vomit that I mentioned earlier, if it caused an experience of disgust and it caused an expression of disgust, the expression strengthens the feeling and the feeling produces the emotion, and there is mutual reinforcement. When you hear the word vomit, you recoil physically, and that's been measured. Everybody, when shown a threatening word or hearing a threatening word, draws back very slightly but distinctly. Recoiling physically induces a negative feeling, and again there is mutual reinforcement and ultimately coherence. When you put two words together like bananas and vomit, something else happens. A story emerges, and it's a causal story. Now, there is really no need for a connection. If you have two words at two ends of the screen, people construct a story and construct a causation, and just the sheer proximity of bananas on this side, vomit on this side, and you tend to be off bananas because bananas cause the vomit. It's a temporary state, but it's a very clear state of something has happened to you. One of the characteristics of this system is that it is not aware of ambiguity, and it tends to suppress ambiguity. So if you hear the sentence, they approached the bank, most of you thought of a bank as, an institution with money and vaults and safes and whatever. But in the context of a trip on the river, the word bank has a completely different meaning. And you wouldn't even be aware, in either case, you wouldn't be aware of the ambiguity in the meaning of the word. The ambiguity has been resolved before you are conscious of anything. When you become conscious of something, you become conscious of a solution. You become conscious of a coherent solution. So, what does System 1 do, and how does it link to various issues in rationality? Well, System 1 is not a stupid one. Actually, what happens is that when we become highly skilled in a performance, very high skill becomes automatic, and very high skill gets all the characteristics of System 1. It happens by itself, it happens without deliberation, it happens associatively, it happens without, really, quite often, without a sense of agency. And let me give you a few examples. We are all impressed by professional examples. We're impressed by the chess masters, the real masters who can see a complex situation while they're walking and say, white mates in 3. That impresses us. We're very impressed with some medical intuitions with physicians who can recognize a case of a particular disease, while passing through the ward. What we don't think about is that every single one of us is an expert at different things. So we're all expert drivers. We're not only expert at driving and at taking turns, we're expert at the psychology of other drivers, so that all of us have developed a sense of discomfort when we're next to a driver that looks dangerous. And there is that intuitive sense, you don't know where. Expertise has developed, and we all have expertise in many domains of life. And because we have expertise in many domains of life, most of the time it is actually System 1 that runs the way our minds work and runs the way that we behave, with System 2 mostly endorsing what System 1 suggests. And this is just fine, because most of the time we are in the domain of our expertise. I will mention in a few minutes what happens when we're not in the domain of our expertise, and then System 1 causes mistakes. But most of the time our behavior is completely appropriate, and we behave appropriately without thinking much. Years ago, I was involved, before Amos and I started collaborating in the 60s, I was involved in measuring the pupil of the eye when people do mental work. And when people do mental work, their pupil dilates, substantially. So if you really try to do 17 times 24 in your head, then your pupil will dilate probably by 50 to 60% in area within a second. So it's very rapid and very reliable. But I happened to be watching the pupil of somebody, we had a projection system. Well, she was just chatting, and nothing happened to the pupil, or very little happened to the pupil. She was conducting a normal conversation. And you realize that the idea of multiplying 17 times 24, this is not the way that we normally think. This is quite rare that we put in that amount of effort to reach a conclusion. Most of the time, things just happen to us. Now, you have to realize how marvelous that system is. I mean, Amos and I are supposed to be the prophets of irrationality, but we clearly, this is not what we worked on. But all our world knowledge is built into our associative memory and is accessed at a speed that is, hard to comprehend. My favorite example is people are listening to sentences, and one of the sentences is spoken in a British upper-class male voice. I will not attempt to imitate it. What the voice says is, "I have large tattoos all down my back." Within about 1/3 of a second, the brain reacts, and the brain reacts with a characteristic signature of surprise. Now, think of it. This is astonishing. By the way, all of you have worked it out. We didn't measure it, but all of you worked it out, and it turns out measuring the brain indicates this takes less than 1/3 of a second. Now that means recognizing the voice as a British upper-class voice. This is not an experiment run in England. It is recognizing that British upper-class males probably don't have large tattoos down their back. That means there is an incongruity. The incongruity is detected. That attracts attention, and there is going to be some processing going on. System 2 will be activated, and attention will be called. This is our knowledge of the world in action. And, to speak about the flaws of intuition in the context of the marvels of intuition, we really have to keep the marvels in mind, because focusing on the flaws is deeply misleading. Now, there is also an extraordinarily rapid updating of our associative memory. This is how we learn about the world. So my favorite example of that was a vacation on which my wife and I were some years ago in a little resort off the coast of Australia. It's called Lizard Island, and there are 40 cabins on that resort, that's all. And we went to dinner, and we met a psychologist we know from Stanford, who was also at dinner. That really struck us as a big coincidence, and, we oohed and ahed and spoke about what had happened. 2 weeks later, I was in London. We're at the theater. The theater was dimmed. Somebody came in and sat next to me. And when the lights came on, it was John. It was the same guy. Now, the point that I want to draw attention to is that we were much less surprised the second time than the first. And instantly, that was because John, he's the guy that we meet all over the place. How do I know this, and why am I sure? Because I'm absolutely sure that if we had met anybody else of our acquaintances, we would have been more surprised. So, and clearly the probability of meeting somebody else rather than meeting the same person again, that probability must be much higher. We are not responding to a low probability event. We were beginning to form a norm, to form a rule about John. It takes one instance and its confirmation. The second confirmation is already less surprising. That is the speed at which we learn. This is the machinery we have in our heads. It's extraordinary machinery. Now, so I've described System 1, as a sort of genius. It does most of the work, and it does it extremely well. But sometimes we get asked questions that we cannot answer. And here there is another characteristic of associative memory. Associative memory tends to produce one coherent interpretation of situations. But when you're asked one question, associative memory computes the answers to several questions. I'll give you an example, because that sounds quite abstract. If I ask people to listen to pairs of words and to press a key whenever two words rhyme, and to press the key as quickly as possible. So you say vote note, that rhymes, people press a key, no problem. You say vote goat, they also rhyme. People are much slower to press the key for vote goat than for vote note. How could that happen? Well, obviously they've done something nobody had asked them to do. They're spelling the words. And so they've detected the words misspelled, vote and goat, are not spelled the same. And so there is a tendency to say no and a tendency to say yes, and it takes time to decide what is what. But so what is happening is that in the computation, we don't, I call that the mental shotgun. We don't aim and shoot a single bullet. There is a scatter of computations. And then something really quite interesting can happen. Sometimes you don't know the answer to the correct question, but you know the answer to a related question. And very frequently, that is what people are going to be doing. They're going to give you the answer to the related question. I'll give you a few examples of that, because it again is abstract. Just a second. All right. I've messed up my slides. All right. How do we select? There are many academics here, although possibly not everybody is an academic, but we all know how people get selected for a job when they give an interview or they give a job talk, in the case of academics. And there is a lot of evidence. Those job talks are given much too much weight. There is, there's a serious question whether they're worth having. And that is because when we are asking the question of whether to hire somebody, then, we might be asking a very difficult question. How likely that person to get tenure in the correct amount of time? That is a very hard question. But there is a very easy question to which we already have the answer. Did we like the talk? And the substitution, so we tend to answer the second question thinking that we're answering the first. And sometimes we'll offer generalization, but rationalizations, but the impetus for this is system one. It's multiple computations were performed, and the correct one is very hard. There are others that are very easy. I'll give you another example. When students are asked in a survey, they're asked two questions in immediate succession. And one is, how happy are you? And the other one is, how many dates did you have last month? Okay? What is the correlation between the answers to those two questions? And the truth is, it depends on the order in which they're asked. So if you ask happiness first and dating second, the correlation is about 0. You turn the order around, the correlation is about as high as it can be. It's 0.66. Now, what is happening here? Deciding how happy you are is really a difficult question. But you are already in a mood when you've just been asked how many dates you're momentarily either pleased with yourself or not so pleased with yourself. You're in a mood. You're asked a related question, how happy are you with your life in general? You already know, and that's what you do. I mean, there are completely absurd demonstrations of this kind, like one of my friends ran a famous experiment where, at the time when there was still, I think it was public phones, or I think it was public phones, maybe Xerox machines that you had to put a coin in. Actually, Xerox machines. In the library, you had to pay. Okay, Maya will do it later. They ran a controlled experiment where somebody was loitering around the copying machine, and for half of the people, when they came to the copying machine, there was a coin right there. So copying cost them nothing. The others, it cost next to nothing. And then the person who was loitering came with a question, with a questionnaire, and one of the questions was, how satisfied are you with your life in general these days? That's a big effect. It's not. Now, again, what is happening is you have an answer. You have a related answer to the question. Here is another one. During the period when there was a fair amount of terrorism in Europe, the following experiment was run. They asked people about travel insurance. They used to sell travel insurance just next to the airplane. You could buy travel insurance. And the question was, how much would you be willing to pay for an insurance policy that pays $100,000 for death for any reason during your trip? And people had to put a number. It's not easy, but they can do it. Then people get asked the question, other people, of course, get asked the question, how much would you pay for a policy that pays $100,000 in case of death in a terrorist incident during your trip? Now, people pay a lot more for the second policy than they pay for the first. Now, why is it? It's because the question of how much you would pay for insurance is very difficult. But there is a much easier question. How afraid are you when I mention dying? And how afraid are you when I mention dying in a terrorist incident? And you are more afraid of dying in a terrorist incident than of dying. That's the way we're put together. It's more concrete and it's more specific, and we have it. We get into trouble when we import an emotion directly onto a statement of economic value, because then it violates the logic of economic value, which imposes inclusion. So the general rule is a rule of substitution. Very often, when you try to answer a question, you do not answer the correct question. You answer a different one. It's related. But you don't know you're doing it because the substitution is itself an operation of system one. It's an automatic operation. And basically, the heuristics of judgment that Amos Tversky and I were studying 30 and 40 years ago, they dealt with substitution. They dealt with answering the wrong question. We were not clear at the time whether people did consciously or did it unconsciously. It's quite clear now that those things, you can do them consciously, and sometimes you do, but most of the time, people answer the wrong questions unconsciously because they substitute unconsciously. And finally, that leads me to the question of confidence. People tell themselves story. And the story starts, even with banana vomit, people create a story. We create stories, and the stories are causal stories. We look for causes. And one of the dramatic differences between intuitive thinking and sort of correct thinking is how poor intuitive thinking is with statistics. Intuitive thinking is a causal system. It looks for causal. And statistics are very different. Statistical regularities are regularities that quite often do not have a cause. The fact that small samples are more variable, they don't cause the variability. It's not the small sample that causes the variability. It's a different relationship. People don't actually reason with that very well with System 1. But we do tell stories. And it turns out that the brain has a mechanism that follows the coherence of the stories. That is, whether they call it fluency, how fluent the processing is. And people are capable of registering that and using that as information. That is truly bewildering. It's work of the last 5 to 10 years, and it's extremely compelling, so that sometimes you get a sense that things go together quite well, and then you're very confident. And sometimes you get a sense that things are not going so well, and then you work harder. When things are going very well, there is, by the way, a strong connection between mood and intuition. When people are in a good mood, things are going well, processing feels fluent, people apply heuristics much more, System 2 is much slower. You cause people to frown, just frown, and it slows them down, and it reduces the number of errors, clearly by activating System 2. So that general coherence and the impact of how you can shape the face on shaping emotions is a key story. And here we have another problem where people, you could say, fail a test of rationality. They're overconfident. They're more confident than they ought to be. And this is because System 1, or associative memory, is designed to create the most coherent story possible on the basis of information available, even when there is very little information or when the information is very poor. We still create stories, and we make very strong predictions on the basis of very poor information. That, by the way, was very clear in Edna's story and in Edna's treatment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can read her treatment of the theories. These people were telling stories. They were doing science, but they were telling stories, and they were looking for the best story possible, the one that would fit, that would be internally coherent. And that were their criteria. And that is a criterion that, by and large, would lead people to considerable overconfidence. So that, let me recapitulate. I've described two systems, an intuitive system and a reasoning system. And I've said that they're fictions, but that they're useful fictions. And I have really said that the intuitive system is most of the time in charge, most of the time because it has expertise. And when it has expertise, it is most of the time correct, which is true most of the time. And occasionally, and those are the situations that Amos and I and many others in our field have studied, occasionally the system fails. And the system fails because You're asked a question that you cannot answer. But system one doesn't like to be stumped. When it doesn't have an answer, but it has the answer to a related question, it will produce that answer to the related question, and it will map it onto the required dimension and produce the answer. Those cases of substitution and related cases of the phenomenon that we call anchoring are the main reasons for the flaws of reasoning that we conducted. And to summarize, what does all of this have to do with rationality? Well, if you really accept this as a plausible definition of the way the mind works, this is not a system that could even come close to the requirement of decision theoretic rationality. It's just not feasible. It is not in the cards, because this is a system that deals with very little information, that is highly context dependent, and it does basically, in terms of reasoning, as little as it can, or as little as it must. And those are the kinds of beings that we are, marvelous and flawed. And that was the story I wanted to tell.